Hello, everybody. My name is Aileen McColgan, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this panel discussion on women's rights. I have a brilliant lineup of speakers. Each speaker will speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and then there'll be a question and answer session. I would urge you all to use the question and answer function throughout the speakers rather than waiting until the end of the final speech, so that questions can be allocated. And I'm told that both Karen Monahan and Christina Mcaney will be leaving early at about 7:15. So if you wish to direct questions to either Christina or Karen, please do so as early as you can. So it's my great pleasure to start by welcoming Christina Mcaney, who, as you all know, was General Secretary of Unison, who will be our first speaker. Christina.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak tonight. It's so important, I think, that we're still carrying on with events like this, even though it's difficult. But given that it's, a few days before International Women's Day, then very important that we keep doing things like this and keep these issues on the agenda. So the unequal impact of COVID-19 on women has been very stark. I'm sure lots has already been said in this conference about over the past couple of days about the unequal impact on women. And in many ways, of course, it's easy to see that women have actually borne the brunt of this pandemic. We ran a survey in Unison just the other week for our women's conference, and it just shows just how true that is. And in just over 2 days, 47,000 women participated in that survey. That was a huge return for us. Women desperate to tell their stories, share their experiences. And it told the story of loneliness, disconnection, isolation, and indeed the impact of what the pandemic was doing for their working life. It showed a deep-seated fear of catching the virus and giving it to a relative or a loved one. And it also highlighted the physical toll of the pandemic, about people not sleeping well or taking regular breaks. But it also showed an increase in issues around domestic violence and a genuine rise in discrimination against pregnant women and women with children and other caring responsibilities. Women in all jobs have ended up juggling work and caring responsibilities, expected to do more than ever with the same number of hours in the day and quite often for lower pay. But of course, the pre-pandemic picture wasn't actually that much better. With inflexible work, too often that saw women disproportionately having to cut their hours, take unpaid leave to cover childcare and elder care, and of course see the impact that had on their progression. And then of course there's the whole issue of low paid. But why wouldn't I say this? It doesn't have to be like that. Stronger employment rights, greater flexibility, and a decent childcare system would help us all to better balance our lives, whatever our circumstances. And change is absolutely imperative if we want to kickstart our economy after this crisis. And there are some key changes to the laws that would make a huge difference to women in this country and women in the workplace. Right at the start of the pandemic, Unison lobbied MPs about concerns about the restrictions brought in by the Coronavirus Act. We called for guaranteed parental leave for the duration of the crisis. We called for the extension of statutory sick pay. And when you look at what happened in some sectors, that was particularly important. And a temporary increase in statutory sick pay rate, which would disproportionately benefit low-paid workers, predominantly women and Black workers. And we need day one rights for all staff to be able to work flexibly and at least have 10 days parental leave to make a significant difference in the workplace. And COVID yet again has shown the acute shortage of accessible and affordable childcare. And so we've also called on the government for an urgent cash injection to ensure that affordable childcare is universally available and for additional funding targeted at provision for children from low-income households. And one of the other key issues I think that we should be considering is the decision by the government to delay gender pay gap reporting by another 6 months after already suspending it for a year in February. It shows we've got a huge problem about how this government views gender equality. If there's no measurement of how much wider the gap has become during COVID, we're never going to be able to hold employers to account. We need to restore gender pay gap reporting, but it's not enough just to report the size of the gap. We need proper action plans that have to be mandatory, and we also believe small employers should also have to report on this. But improving this is just half, improving legal rights is just half the story. Most of all, we need to make sure women's voices are at the heart of shaping what comes out of the other side of COVID. It's a scandal that only 1 in 6 women, mainly those in the lowest pay, have had to reduce their hours at work as a direct result of school and childcare closures, and some have been forced out of work altogether. And yesterday's announcement that the government proposes a 1% pay increase, or thinks that's all we should be entitled to in the NHS, is such an insult. And when you look at the workforce in the NHS, it is predominantly women who work in the NHS and predominantly women who will be affected by this. But I suppose for me, one of the key things to come out of this would be what would make the biggest difference to certainly many of the members that we've got in Unison, and that would be a legislation that actually does something, not just about the gender pay gap, but about the fact that there is so much gender segregation in work. So when you look at the jobs that we've now seen as being essential during this pandemic, and when you look at the jobs that are traditionally undervalued, we're looking predominantly at caring jobs, education, early years, cleaning and catering work, people who work in the care sector, all predominantly large groups of women. And there's a reason why they're so poorly paid, and that's because we do not value the skills and the jobs that they bring, the skills that they bring to those particular jobs. And so for me, one of the key things would be, can we bring in something which is about having proper pay and conditions in sectors? Can we bring in some legislation which looks specifically at how you would job evaluate particular large categories of jobs and start to put a proper value on the worth of those jobs? You know, it's a sad reality that we pay people more to look after animals in a zoo than we pay them to look after children in a nursery. We pay people more to collect tickets at a train station than we do to look after our elderly relatives in a care home. And that's not to criticise people who look after animals in a zoo or people who collect tickets at a station. It's a reflection in the fact that we do not value the skills that predominantly women bring to these roles. And so that kind of, apologies. And so that gender discrimination, gender segregation in work is something that we need to seriously look at and find a way to deal with that. So that would be my plea in terms of what I think should be the biggest issue around changing laws. So thank you. I'll stop there. I hope I've stuck to time.
Many thanks, Christina. You did indeed. Again, I encourage people to line up some questions for after the speakers have spoken. So again, it's my great pleasure now to welcome Karen Monahan, who is one of the, if not the leading barrister who deals with gender equality rights in the workplace.
Thank you, Aileen. Thank you, everybody. Welcome. I can't see anybody, but I hope you're all out there and you can hear me okay. Really just building on something Christina was talking about, but in the context of equal pay. I think one of the weaknesses at the moment about our labour laws is they essentially impose negative obligations on employers. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. If you do this, we may have an unfair dismissal claim. You do that, we may be able to bring a claim for disability discrimination and so on. But there's very little by way of positive obligation. We have positive obligations in the sphere of health and safety. We have limited ones, as Christina's already said, so far their introduction's delayed, but some limited obligations in relation to equal pay and some wider obligations in relation to the public sector. So as many of you will know, there is a public sector equality duty on public sector employers, that duty requires them to have due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination and promote equality of opportunity, and it imposes specific monitoring duties on employers, most of which aren't complied with, and requirements to report on matters relevant to the duty. So report on matters relating to the elimination of discrimination and the promotion of equality. Those are very process-driven obligations because they require due regard. So they require employers to show that they've had regard, to show they're discharging their monitoring obligations. Now, it seems to me those duties could be strengthened, and we should be calling for them to be strengthened, so that not only is there a bureaucratic duty to have regard, but there is a duty to secure equality in outcomes. So requiring employers to ensure that their policies in relation to care leave, leave, for example, in relation to Black and minority ethnic workers and those who aren't able to have vaccines or are more vulnerable, those sorts of positive obligations to ensure this equality in the workplace. We don't see those, save in respect of the weak duties imposed on public sector employers, and we certainly don't see them in the context of private sector employers. So it seems to me we need to be, I mean, this has been something that's come up over the years, so it's not a new subject, but we need to be calling again, in particular at this time, for there to be positive obligations on employers to take specific steps to ensure that women aren't disadvantaged in the workplace, and that includes Black and minority ethnic women and disabled women, mothers, carers, and so on. Those obligations, as I say, should include proper monitoring obligations. At the moment, they are largely ignored. And I have to say, there doesn't seem to be a lot of activity among trade unions in dealing with that. There was at the very outset when the duties first came into force, but I think everybody's become sort of weary about them. And rather than being weary about them, it seems to me that we should be seeking to ensure that there are more compelling duties. And just picking up on what Christina was saying a moment ago in relation to, for example, care leave and flexible working, those are just the sorts of matters that a properly drawn up positive obligation on all employers, private and public sector, would help secure if there were some outcome obligations. So those are the sorts of things that I think we should be looking at. And as Christina also said, there are some, as I opened with a moment ago, there are some obligations in relation to equal pay, but things like action plans, we should be looking at securing those sorts of obligations among employers more generally. There should be action plans. What are you doing to secure equality in outcomes? And we simply haven't seen those, and we don't see those. And I think that's something we should be calling for more specifically. That's my 5 minutes, Aileen. I hope I didn't go over time.
No, very impressive timekeeping thus far. So thank you both. Thank you, Karen, for that. And the next speaker is Shavana Taj, who is the Wales TUC's General Secretary, and the first, but I hope not the last, BME General Secretary for TUC Wales. So thank you, Shav.
Thanks, everyone. Firstly, I just want to say a massive Diane and well done to the TUC Women's Committee and Sean and the TUC's Equalities team for organising such an inspiring women's conference this year. It's our first virtual conference course for women. And honestly, you've completely smashed it out, completely you have. There's been so many rich conversations about how we organise and how we fight for our future post-pandemic as we enter into an extremely worrying recession. I wanted to talk a little bit about where we are with gender equality in Wales. Whilst women have been at the forefront of this pandemic, health and social care workers, key workers, uni leaders, as women, negotiating, bargaining, improving policy, campaigning to protect workers, more women coming forward to become health and safety reps, negotiating, COVID secure agreements, and here in Wales campaigning, and we now have one, that individual risk assessments are now mandatory under coronavirus regulations. It doesn't actually necessarily equate over to having women in positions of power. Wales became the first country in the world in 2003 to have an equal number of men and women in parliament. However, polls have suggested that actually just 34% of female candidates for May's Senate elections are going to be in winnable seats. And this means that our parliament is actually going to be even less diverse. So, and actually when it comes to BME women, we are completely invisible in such positions of power. I am probably the most senior BME woman in any kind of position of leadership in Wales. And it's great because it's, it is the trade union movement very much leading the way on that. And I definitely hope never to be the last one. I would love to see many more sisters surrounding me. So in order to ensure that we have been able to address gender inequality in areas such as social care, that's often been deemed as the poorer cousin of the NHS, we have now set up a social care forum with a view to organise and bring care back into public ownership, which really gives us an opportunity to remove gender pay gaps and create opportunities for progression. And in March 2018, the then First Minister announced a rapid review of gender equality to ensure the Welsh Government became a feminist government. And this rapid review became what was then known as Phase 1 of the Gender Equality Review. Phase 2 was completed in 2019, and it came with the publication of Deeds Not Words, a report and a roadmap, which had a vision and a set of 50 recommendations for achieving gender equality in Wales. So in March 2019, Welsh Government signed up to a vision and principles for gender equality in Wales. That means an equal sharing of power, resources and influence for all women, men and non-binary people, a vision where government aims to create conditions for equality and outcome for all. Now, as has been said by the previous speaker, having visions and having plans for how we do things is one thing, but if we don't, as trade unionists, really engage with that process and continue to campaign, nothing ever really changes. So the Wales TUC Equalities Committee now regularly meets with the Minister for Equality, and actually our Equalities Policy Officer has recently been seconded over to the Welsh Government Equalities Department to help with the drafting up of a Race Equality Action Plan and Disability Action Plan as well. And we are, looking to do everything that we can to remove any barriers and systemic failures that genuinely have stood in the way of progress to be torn down just once and for all. This is our real opportunity where we have got a kind of government that talks to us on a regular basis, a minister that engages very openly with trade unions to make that change once and for all. But the truth of the matter is that, what we have seen during this pandemic is that you have women leaders that have been negotiating so many good policies and practices to keep people safe at work. As we move forward, when it comes to building back, if women are not at the negotiating table, when we talk about putting equality in the heart of everything that we do, we are simply going to be left at the margins and nothing will change. And I think that in Wales here, we now have a real fighting chance to make that happen. We've recently welcomed the consultation on the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Bill, which actually establishes a duty on public bodies covered by the Future Generations Act to consult with trade unions when they set their wellbeing objectives. And this is going to ensure that the interests of workers are properly reflected in any action which bodies such as councils and health boards take under their sustainable development responsibilities. The fact is, employers are extremely powerful. They've got lots more resources than we have to dedicate to lobbying government. And this is just completely unfair. So we believe that this legislation is going to be our opportunity to balance that power dynamic out and to make sure the workers are listened to. The draft legislation actually also sets out a plan for socially responsible procurement and places the duty on public bodies to ensure that their procurement spend is contributing to fair work, equality and well-being goals. And trade unions hope that this will mean that procurement spend leads to better jobs being created in all parts of Wales, but especially in those communities where good work is scarce and women are often the biggest losers when it comes to fair work and good quality flexible work. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Shab. And next, we're going to hear from Mary Olberry from Flex, which is the focus on labour exploitation. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you. Everyone's kept to time so well, so I'm going to try to do the same. So my name is Mary Olberry. I'm research manager at Focus on Labour Exploitation. For those of you who don't know who we are, we're a research and advocacy organisation, and we work to end labour exploitation. And what I mean by that is that we're not looking necessarily at the kind of criminal side of things. We're not focusing on gangs and traffickers and exploiters, but instead addressing the kind of structural issues that actually make people vulnerable to exploitation. So that includes, for example, gaps in employment law, the lack of enforcement of labour standards, immigration policy, and gender inequality. What we do is we do research on the drivers of exploitation, mainly in formal sectors of the economy like cleaning and hospitality that are low paid and insecure, and where there are minoritized groups like women, ethnic minorities, and migrants who are overrepresented in those sectors. And then we use the findings that we get from the research to advocate for evidence-based change. What I want to talk about today is the importance of including workers' perspectives in this kind of policy work. And it's a topic that comes up regularly, but it's often difficult to do in practice, especially in sectors where groups face barriers to organizing. So more specifically, I want to talk about how policy research can be done in a more participatory way, so working with workers from high-risk sectors rather than kind of on or for them. And to do this, for the past 2 years, we've been piloting an approach called Feminist Participatory Action Research, or FPAR for short. And the reason that we're doing that is that we believe that through direct experience, workers in high-risk sectors have important insight about what contributes and drives labour exploitation. They're experts in their own right, and their knowledge can help identify and shape better policy solutions. But unfortunately, despite their expertise by experience, despite being the ones most affected by such policy decisions, workers at risk are rarely involved by policymakers in developing solutions. And by making our research participatory, we want to bring the voices of workers directly to policymakers so that we can start seeing more effective change. In terms of what FPAR actually is, it's an approach to research where those most affected by an issue are engaged and supported to create knowledge for change. So it's not research for the sake of research, but research for policy making and for advocacy. And what makes it feminist is its focus on engaging with women and migrants and other minoritized and traditionally othered groups to highlight and also challenge intersecting forms of oppression, so poverty, racism, gender inequality, and so on. And what that looks like in practice is that we've recruited workers, mostly women, all been migrants, from 3 low-paid and insecure sectors with low union representation. So those have been cleaning, hospitality, and the app-based delivery sector, so in the gig economy. We've recruited those workers to work with us as paid peer researchers, and they receive training and ongoing support from Flex, and they've been participating in all aspects of the research, from design to data collection to analysis and advocacy. In practice, that means that they've been deciding what questions need asking. They've been doing interviews and focus groups with their peers, often in languages other than English, developing recommendations and advocating for change. Doing research in this way means that we've uncovered a broad range of issues and we're understanding them more holistically. So I want to bring in one specific example to show how FPAR can work. And to do that, I want to talk about our findings on sexual harassment in the workplace. So when we first started researching in cleaning and hospitality, we knew that sexual harassment was an issue. But when we asked about it in scoping interviews with workers, people mainly shrugged it off. They wanted to move on to the next question. We didn't get a lot of data on it from these interviews. And if we'd been doing more traditional research, we'd probably not have had a lot of data to go on. We probably would have had to say what is often said, which is that we expect it's a much larger issue than what's being reported. But because when we started engaging workers from those sectors as peer researchers, they actually raised sexual harassment as a key issue that they thought the research needed to examine. And that was because they'd also experienced it themselves and they wanted something done about it. So what happened was they raised it in interviews that they did with other workers. They organized focus groups specifically on that topic as well. And we found that people were much more comfortable speaking about sexual harassment in a setting where they knew that others shared their experience and with a facilitator who understood the issue and the sector, unsurprisingly. And our understanding of sexual harassment from the perspective of this specific group, so low-paid workers in precarious jobs, mainly migrant women, increased as a result. So it showed us that sexual harassment is linked to and inseparable from other workplace issues, for instance, outsourcing, low pay, job insecurity. And it also showed us how the specific experiences of the group we were engaging with were also linked to their experiences of sexual harassment. So for instance, insecure immigration status, language barriers, those kinds of issues came up. And from this engagement, we could see that for solutions to be effective, they had to take into account not just sexual harassment, but also these other issues and aspects. So for instance, if we wanted to increase awareness about sexual harassment and how to report it in a workplace, that's obviously hugely important, but it wouldn't address the fact that 22% of our participants said they wouldn't complain about issues at work for fear of not being put on the rota next week, or that 24% said they didn't seek help with workplace issues because of language barriers. I wanted to highlight this example because I think it clearly shows how important it is to actually engage workers in developing policy solutions. And though it's been quite challenging managing a research project that engages workers as peer researchers, it's a lot more time consuming, but I think it's also hugely rewarding and something that we should be doing in the future more of. I don't know if it's cheeky to say, but we're going to be publishing a handbook on this experience for Women's Day on Monday. And I'd be happy to share that if others are interested in repeating this kind of research process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very depressing, but invaluable, I'd say. I have some questions to kick us off, and I'm going to steer the questions in the first instance towards Christina and Karen, but I'll invite Mary and Shav to jump in if they wish. Question I'll start with is this, and it's primarily directed towards Christina, but that doesn't mean others can't jump in, as I say. We know privatization of our public services leads to casualisation and increased insecurity at work for previously securely employed public sector workers. How can we fight against further privatisation and get our public services back into public ownership?
Thank you. Yeah, so we run an almost constant campaign on this, I have to say, it feels like. So we've had a bit of a, like many unions, a bit of a twin track approach to this, which is opposing privatisation, but also following the members when it happens or if it happens, and making sure that we can still campaign and organise members and defend them and fight for their rights when they're in these private sector organisations. So one of the key things for me in terms of trying to fight this and bring things back, obviously the ideal is to get things back into public ownership, and that would be in a UK context, or certainly in an English context, needing a Labour government if I'm being, that has to be what we get in. The chances of getting it under anything other than the Labour government, I think, are relatively slim. But what we can do as trade unions, I think, is to fight against the privatisations that we see happening within individual workplaces. So where we see, for example, in the health sector or in local government, particular services going out, we've put in place a system where we can work directly with our branches to give them expert advice. So we have access to people who've got that expert advice on going over the proposals that are coming forward and being able to fight back against them. And we've done it successfully in a number of areas, particularly in the NHS. We've been quite successful in holding back some of the privatisations. But in terms of wide scale things, so we need total reform of areas like social care. 80% of it currently provided in the private and voluntary sector, and that needs a proper commitment to actually shift the whole agenda in the way we consider services like social care, and stop the way we see it and people see it as a drain in society, see it as part of the infrastructure, and see it as a continuum with health. And that's a longer term, wider campaign, but certainly one that we can work on.
Many thanks for that, Christina. Does anybody else want to jump in, or will I move to the next question? If anyone else wants to jump in, just raise your hand. No, well then I'll go to the next question, which is also primarily for Christina, but Karen and Shav may well want to jump in. Women working in the NHS, and it actually leads on from what you've just been speaking about, Christina. Women working in the NHS and social care and education have been on the front line of this crisis, keeping our economy going and people alive. But as you said, those working in the care sector are chronically underpaid and undervalued. What do you think is the first step a union can take in creating a change around how different sectors are valued? And what could leaders in the sectors do to change the narrative around the sectors?
Part of when I got to the end of my introduction, one of the key things I was saying was we need to shift in the way that we value jobs that are seen as traditionally being done by women. And that's why, as the questioner says, it's about care service, it's about many of the things that are done in health, and it's about many of the things that are done in childcare or in education, predominantly all done by women. So there is that whole shift in culture and attitude, I think, that needs to come out of it. And that's one of the things I hope does come out of as we come through this, through the pandemic, and we see a kind of post-COVID world beginning to emerge. Although the announcements that we've had this week from this government don't lend they certainly don't seem to see that they're thinking in that way. So there's a lot for us to do. I think some of the things we have to be doing is making sure that as trade unions we're organising in those sectors. But more than organising in those sectors, we have to make sure that the people we organise, particularly women that we're organising, have a voice in our unions. And too often their voice is drowned out, if I can say it, by other more traditional groups within the union. And that's something I'm very conscious of. And certainly when I was standing in the campaign to be General Secretary, I saw it firsthand how often, even in a union that's as committed to proportionality and fair representation as Unison is, how often that voice isn't heard. So for me, it's about organising, but it's about making sure that you've got your structures right within the union. And it's about giving hope, I think, and getting out and making sure that we're providing services and support to women in a way that they want them delivered, not us always telling people what is best for them or what they should be getting, but actually listening to our members about what are their key priorities, and giving them the feeling that they have a say in what happens in those services, and they have a say in what the union's campaigns will be for them.
Thank you very much indeed, Christina. And I think Shav, you can jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to that, and that is that we've actually learnt that we can still have democratic oversight by working and organising in a different way. So we don't necessarily all have to be sat in a big conference hall or physically be in the same space in order to have our voices heard. And I think that this has been, for a very long time, the trade union movement has talked about doing things differently. And everyone was, you know, some people have trialed the possibilities of using video conferencing, for example. But it was often, you know, for a couple of people and nothing more than that. But we've learned something during this period. And I think that we need to not forget about it. And I think that there needs to be options now whereby maybe we look at, for examples of even having like a hybrid version of a conference, like the TUC did, where you have some people physically being there, others who can then dial in from wherever they are, as long as they're in a quiet space, so that they can engage in union democracy and have a real say about the policies that we work through and what we develop. I also think that it is about remaining relevant, and it is about remaining open. So a lot of unions have held open events that are open to any member of the public. So a lot of the stuff that we would do would generally happen behind the scenes. And I think that we've become much more visible and as a result, more louder. And we have been able to demonstrate the real value in being a member of a trade union. So rather than us just going down the traditional route of leaflets and that type of thing, we've learned to introduce different types of digital organizing. It is no longer a niche thing. You know, this should remain a part of our practice going forward. And I think that's how we will continue to build and grow our movement, and including when it comes to training and developing as well. There's lots of women that have come forward during the pandemic who we haven't yet had the opportunity to train in a classroom setting, so to speak. Many of them have just jumped in and learnt on the job. But that doesn't mean that we should, undervalue their skills, but we should be building them up and finding ways and means of them still being able to participate, regardless of what hours they are working, what shifts they're working. They should still be, they should be valued going forward. And I think that, in terms of, it goes back to what Christina was saying, we've got a socialist Labour government that works for trade unions in Wales. And I can tell you for free, whilst we don't agree with them on every single thing, and we do stand our ground and kick off if we need to, and retain our right for industrial action should we need to, and that threat. The fact of the matter is that when you've got a government that is prepared to engage with you and with the employer side, as an equal partner, it is only then that you can move forward and start looking at the real possibilities of bringing public services back in-house. And the budget told us that, didn't it? So.
Thank you very much indeed, Shav. The next question is for Karen primarily, but again, everyone is welcome to add their thoughts. Karen, we know pregnancy discrimination has risen sharply during the pandemic, as has discrimination against disabled women. Unemployment has risen much faster among BME women than among white women. What can we do to strengthen the law and tackle double discrimination where it occurs? You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm obviously not a good example of sisters working out how to use technology. Well, as I said in the short comments I made a moment ago, I think we need much more compelling duties on employers to monitor, to take action, have action plans, proper redundancy policies, and so on. And we need to do that. We need probably to have a better labour inspection system so that actually we have people going out there and monitoring employers. We really don't have a labour inspection system at all now. That's something we really ought to be doing. And lots of the international labour bodies are saying that the UK's labour inspection system is wholly inadequate. But as for the second part of the question, what about women who have multiple characteristics that together are causing them disadvantage in the workplace? So Black women, disabled women, how do we manage that sort of intersectional experience? Well, as many of you will know, there was provision in the Equality Act introduced in 2010 to provide protection against discrimination connected with multiple characteristics. So the experience of being a pregnant woman or a migrant pregnant worker carries with it multiple experiences which together may be very different to the singular experience of a white pregnant woman, for example. And there's no way at the moment of addressing that through the Equality Act. We need to have protection against intersectional discrimination, but that provision was never brought into force. It was enacted under the Labour government in the very last days of the outgoing Labour government and never brought into force by the coalition government and then the Tory government. And so we have no means of protecting against those intersectional forms of discrimination. If your experience is of a mentally ill pregnant woman, you can either bring a claim based on your pregnancy or your mental ill health, but you can't place your experience, your whole experience, within the scope of the Equality Act. And I think that is, it most certainly is a real weakness. I mean, it's without doubt a serious problem.
Thanks, Karen. And there's another question aimed primarily at you, which is this: women cannot challenge unequal pay if they do not know what their co-workers are being paid. What legislative drivers or positive obligations do you think trade unions should campaign for in order to bring about greater pay transparency in the workplace?
Well, obviously we want the duties that already exist to be brought into force, and not for there to be endless delays. But leaving aside labour inspection, and labour inspection would have a fantastic role in dealing with inequality in pay in the workplace, including arising from occupational segregation that Christina was talking about a moment ago. I think there should be, as I said again, and I'll say again, I think unions should be campaigning for positive outcome-focused duties. So not just, I mean, they're very bureaucratic monitoring duties like equal pay audits, monitoring composition of the workforce are critically important. But without there being outcome obligations, without there being some duty to achieve something at the outset, even the drawing up of an action plan, while it's really, really important, it doesn't really help if actually what it results in just more bureaucracy. So more monitoring of some other form of monitoring. You know, there needs to be some obligation to achieve certain outcomes. Employers should have to, there should be obligations for them to identify those outcomes and timelines for achieving them, and if necessary, penalties imposed on not achieving them. And again, these aren't outlandish things. They are things we see in other jurisdictions. They are things that we see in other jurisdictions that are enforceable by a fully functioning labour inspectorate that has functions including attaching punitive measures, fines, and so on, sometimes very significant ones, to employers who fail to achieve the outcomes that have been set for them or that they've set themselves pursuant to, you know, the sort of positive obligations that I was talking about. So I think maybe in the women's movement and in trade unions, we should be really again calling for more robust duties. There was a period where that was sort of on the agenda, but with everything else, you know, living under a Tory government effectively for 10 years is, you know, things have moved up, other things have moved up the agenda, obviously.
Thank you, Karen. I think you and Christina are going to slide off at this stage. And thank you very, very much for your contributions. And we'll carry on until 7:30 with Shav and Mary. So thank you. And
okay, well, it's been lovely. Really
have a good evening.
And,
yeah, thank you.
And I hope you have a great session until the end. Thank you.
Bye.
See you, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.
So I'm going to move to Mary now. I haven't forgotten you, Shav, but Mary's yet to get a chance to speak. So Mary, you identified the need to engage workers in policy solutions, particularly where it comes to migrant women who face additional barriers and challenges in claiming their rights. The employment bill is due sometime this year. What would Flex's 3 key calls to change it? What would be Flex's 3 key calls to changes that trade unions could take up and amplify based on your work with migrant women?
It's a good question. I'm having to think a bit on the fly. But there are definitely things that have come out of the out of our research in cleaning and hospitality and this participatory research that we've been doing. And I think one of the key things is the kind of insecurity of workers and how that affects everything from joining a trade union to complaining about issues and to kind of trying to make any changes. If you're too afraid of losing your job or not being put on the rota, then you're not going to kind of rock the boat or engage with trade unions. So that's definitely one issue. Another one is one that Karen was mentioning a few times, which is the kind of lack of labour market enforcement and labour inspection, especially in really high risk sectors. And it's especially worrying now when there's kind of no director of labour market enforcement in place. And with COVID, where inspections have kind of turned into online inspections rather than in-person ones. So that's another issue. And then I would say, I guess, language barrier comes out really strongly in a lot of the research in terms of a barrier to accessing justice, a barrier to accessing knowledge about rights, and so on. So if there's things that can be done about that, just even accessing ACAS, calling ACAS, they have provisions to provide interpretation, but only if you're able to navigate in English through the whole system to then reach the point where you can say, actually, I can't do this in English. So there are very practical things, and with more time, I'm sure I'd have even more concise calls, but those would be 3 things that I would highlight.
That's very helpful as someone who's trying to recently to navigate through French bureaucracy with very limited French. Again, in order to get to the English-speaking assistance, you need to speak French. It's a very good practical suggestion. Shav, given your insight into the Welsh Government's response to the crisis, and you've mentioned the beauty of working with the socialist government, but given your insight into the Welsh Government's response to the crisis, do you think that there's learning that unions need to push for with the UK government?
Yes, I would say that there is, funnily enough, we have been lobbying some of the Tory MPs we now have. And some of them have actually been supportive of the need to make improvements and make changes to our social security system in particular. And it's been quite interesting because they have had a lot of local constituents who have been speaking to them and explaining to them that how difficult life currently is. I think that, some of the things that we have seen across the country this time around has been quite interesting in that you've got trade unions and business organizations working more closely together. We have had, joint demands. I think that helps when you make representations to government in terms of what it is that you're seeking. But of course, it is not necessary that what business wants and what employer wants is exactly what workers need. Either. So I think that it is about a balancing act. But, I'd say to everyone, I think we need to be pushing our UK Labour government, shadow Labour government, to be maybe to learn from the Welsh Labour government as well in terms of the things that they are doing whilst they're here and whilst they are in power, because they've had some, really good wins. So when they are developing their own national policies, I think they should look closer to home rather than looking elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Mary, I've got another one for you. And the questioner wants to know, have you had any success, I think maybe not personally you, but Flex, had any success in getting an employer to change policy as a result of your work? And if so, what was it that encouraged the employer to make the change?
So as an organization, we mainly, or our key policy target is the government, but we are raising issues with employers also. And one of the things that we're looking to do is create, for instance, in cleaning, kind of worker-driven standards for ethical procurement or ethical outsourcing. Also kind of recognizing that we might not have very much success with the current government in kind of achieving our policy wins, and that we should work more closely with employers. So some of the things that we've seen when we look at outsourcing is the kind of power that the client company has in impacting employment rights and standards for workers in their domestic supply chain. And for instance, what we saw in the research was where client companies intervened, for instance, in cases of sexual harassment, those were some of the most effective policy changes or things that employers did. So there was a case where they raised sexual harassment of a cleaner with the cleaning company and said that one of the cleaning company employees was harassing someone else and they need to address it. And the cleaning company did nothing. And what the client company then did was said, well, if you're not going to address this, we're going to go to a different supplier. So there are definitely things that employers can do, and things that we're also looking to develop that we could kind of support employers to do that more.
Thank you for that. Shab, you mentioned you had something upbeat to say, which was how we've learned in terms of organisation, how there are different ways. There's more than one way to skin a cat. We've learned how to engage people who aren't physically present, and in a bit of a development of that, this question is as follows. So the movement has made significant progress in recent years in increasing women's representation and power within our movement, but LBT women, Black and minority ethnic women, and disabled women remain vastly underrepresented. What action can we take to change this and ensure that we build a truly inclusive and diverse movement with women represented at all levels of power and decision making?
So this is quite an interesting one, because I have been involved in a range of different campaign groups here in Wales, even specifically around this issue, because to give you an example, there was a publication by a very well-known women's charity in Wales. It was a publication that celebrated the women of COVID. There was not one BME woman listed at all in the entire publication. The BBC also in Wales recently put out a similar sort of news story on their website. And again, there was no BME person featured at all, despite the fact that actually when it came to key workers, frontline workers, the ones that were first to sadly lose their lives on the front line were from BME backgrounds. So we're dealing with systemic structural inequalities, and we talk a very good talk within the movement, but also across society as socialists, as trade unionists, as campaigners for social justice, that, you know, we put equality at the heart of everything. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes either people forget to be inclusive, or actually it is simply a case of they are not prepared to understand that it is better for everybody when we can share power, and where we can actually make space at the table. And just like we ask our, one of my trade union sisters in Scotland talks about step aside brother, and step forward sister, but equally she says to women, to white women, step aside sister and step forward every other person that is often forgotten about. And it is very important that when we are talking about these issues, that if you come from a learned place or you're talking about research, this is different to you talking on behalf of those individuals. So I think that, there's lessons to be learned in that sense, but equally, if you can see that something is wrong, and you are not somebody that has that particular protected characteristic, call it out and stand in solidarity and unity with that individual and be there for them, and, you know, show up at every single time, not just at times when it suits you, or, you know, when it's a particular hashtag or a particular day that we're celebrating. You know, we have to fight for equity and justice at all times, because for some of us, it's not a given.
Very wise words. Mary, you spoke about the specific barriers faced by women who are experiencing or have experienced sexual harassment. And the questioner says, we know that 4 out of 5 women don't report sexual harassment to their employer, but reporting to unions is also low. What can trade unions do, particularly workplace reps, to create safer workplaces where migrant women feel able to report sexual harassment?
I think it's a really good question. I think there are a lot of different ways to approach it. One of the big things that came out when we talked to our research participants and peer researchers about it was that, first of all, it needs to be talked about more. Just the fact that it's not really talked about at workplaces, at least the ones that our participants were in, was important. Also, just feeling, being able to recognize what is actually sexual harassment and what isn't, and then also feeling validated when you come forward, that your experience is recognized and that you're supported in that process. But like I was saying, I think it's really hard to remove things like fear of losing your work or fear of losing your job, or of having negative consequences from reporting. And solely relying on individuals coming forward to report issues, I don't think is enough, and that we need to kind of proactively do things about this. So one thing would be introducing a proactive duty for employers to have proper reporting structures. And I think this is something that the government already consulted on, but I'm not sure that that there's any movement on that. And if there was a positive duty for employers to kind of address sexual harassment, then also that would give more powers, for instance, to the Equality and Human Rights Commission to actually step into workplaces, require employers to have action plans instead of having reactively to react to women coming forward and reporting issues. Also, Karen mentioned the equality duty for public sector bodies. For me, at least, that would mean that labour inspectorates should also think about, for instance, sexual harassment in the workplace. So others than just the Equality and Human Rights Committee, but also, for instance, the Health and Safety Executive should potentially look at sexual harassment in the workplace and proactively act on that. It should be part of their work on work-related violence, and currently sexual harassment isn't part of that definition. And if you would have kind of these public bodies who would be able to go and support workers to address these issues and require employers to have policies in place, then I think we would see more women also coming forward. But solely relying on women to report on sexual harassment, I don't think is the solution.
Couldn't agree more. The last question is helpfully directed to both of you, and we've got about 2 minutes for you to answer it. So how can we maintain employer pressure when we start to return to normal and emerge out of the pandemic in the midst of an economic squeeze where equality might be squeezed out? How do we avoid equality being squeezed out? So we'll take you first.
Sorry, was that me? Oh, yeah, okay. Just really quickly, I'd say organize, organize, organize. Make sure that every single person that you know who is not yet a member of a union, get them to join a trade union, first and foremost. Any person that has been interested in anything during this period, some of your colleagues who may not yet be members of a trade union, but have benefited off the back of you negotiating improvements so that they can be kept safe at work, remind them to join the trade union. And it was because of the fact that you were there making those demands of the employer that things changed for the better. But equally, I think that when it comes to the employer, there's lessons to be learnt in terms particularly of as we build back, and there's lots of employers have been talking about building back more fairly, more equitably, more justly. And as they talk about a green and just transition, those negotiations, workers, particularly women, have to be at the forefront of that transition. So those agreements and those negotiations, you've got to include women. And I think that is the way that we are going to be able to remind people. So, celebrate our wins, but let's just keep growing and winning.
Thank you. And a final word from you, Mary.
Definitely organize, join trade unions. That's something we also try to raise through our research and our advocacy that people need to do. But also kind of solidarity with all women, including migrant women, and especially in the kind of context of Brexit, where we're seeing migrants being potentially blamed for standards and conditions being lowered, to recognize that we need to organize all of us together and to push back on that as a front and not kind of scapegoat anyone or shift the blame onto anyone else. I would say that.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I'm asked in wrapping up, well, I thank you both very much, and also thanks to Karen and Christina, but I'm also told that women are filling up the comments with support for all of the speakers' comments, particularly around organising, so that women do not have to sacrifice their womanhood or any of their intersectional issues in this battle to improve the position of women in the workplace and in representative democracy. So I think that's it. So thank you very much indeed, and many thanks to everyone who attended, and I'm delighted to have chaired. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.
Thank you very much.